Hello, welcome to the Nerdy Photographer Podcast. I am Casey Fatchett, your host, and in this episode, we're going to go over some of the top stories in the photo industry for the year 2020. Yes, it's year-end wrap-up time, folks. All that and more after this short break.
Yeah, so I'm not sure how we handle the situation.
Did you have a contract?
Well, I had one I found for free online, but my lawyer says it might not hold up.
Next time you should head over to nerdyphotographer.com. They've got a selection of contract templates for weddings, events, portrait sessions, and even for hiring second photographers and associate photographers, which would certainly have helped you in your current situation.
Really? I will check that out. Nerdyphotographer.com?
Yep, nerdyphotographer.com. They've got all sorts of contracts and agreements that can help make sure to protect you and your clients. So what are you going to do?
Well, we just have to wait and see what happens, I guess.
So, no pants on?
Who know anything below the waist? Totally Porky Pig in it.
Impressive.
Not really. It was pretty cold out.
Yeah.
Yep.
Hey, photographers! The Nerdy Photographer Podcast wants to hear your stories. That's right. If you have an amazing, crazy, funny, heartwarming, or even tragic or disturbing story you've personally experienced as a photographer, we want to hear about it. Go to nerdyphotographer.com and submit your story or stories. Doesn't have to be just one, and we may feature them on the podcast. And if you want, you can tell the story yourself on the podcast. We would love to have you on as a guest. What have you got to lose? Share your photography story with us and see what develops. Well, if you're listening to this episode, congratulations on making it to the end of 2020. It has been an absolute hell of a year, crazy for so many reasons. And some of the big stories in the photo industry this year are things like Canon finally got serious about mirrorless cameras. Look at that, ladies and gentlemen. As a Canon shooter, I can say that I am proud to finally enter the mirrorless generation. They finally released their professional mirrorless camera, the R5, as well as the R6. Personally, I am thrilled about having a lighter weight camera that I can travel with more easily. But there are still those issues that haunt all mirrorless cameras, like battery life and low light autofocus. There was also some talk about overheating issues when using video, but the majority of users would never encounter those issues anyway. Canon released the patch. Whatever, it doesn't seem like that huge of an issue. Also, very importantly, if you pay any attention to any online photography forums, the cameras feature dual camera slots, and that's all that really matters. And we can all rest easy at night knowing that you can put 2 memory cards in these cameras. Another big story, at least in my opinion, for 2020 for the photography industry was catering to influencers. Camera companies and even lighting equipment manufacturers set their sights on a new market for photography: influencers. Camera companies aimed their mirrorless offerings at influencers and vloggers for lightweight content creation. Do I mean lightweight content, or do I mean lightweight cameras? Ooh, that's up to you to decide. Sony even released a compact, full-frame mirrorless camera, the A7C. And, not to be outdone, Profoto released the small hockey puck-like C1 and C1 Plus lights for phone photographers. Phone photographers got Profoto lights. The lights can be used with Profoto's remote trigger, so you can use the system on a mirrorless or DSLR camera. The lights, which range from $300 to $500 each, are obviously aimed at the influencer crowd because who else is going to drop that kind of money on a light that has very limited range of use? I mean, for that sort of money, you could be getting like a Godox, like the 300 or 200. You could be getting 1 or 2 of those and use them for all sorts of things, as opposed to this, tiny little phone photography light. One of the other biggest stories of the year: representation. People of color, black photographers. We've seen a lot of strides forward following the protests that swept through the United States and in other parts of the world. and many outlets published lists of black photographers to start following. Sony expanded its Alpha Plus female program, so a dozen female photographers will now receive a $5,000 grant plus $3,000 in equipment. It's great to see more camera companies realizing that their ambassador programs should perhaps reflect the demographics of the market. Weird when you see 50, ambassadors and they're all dudes. Overall, we saw greater inclusion by the end of 2020. However, we also saw some prominent members of the photography community get called out for either tone deaf or outright racist comments they made this year. And you know what? It's probably a good thing that we're leaving those people behind in 2020. We should be striving to move forward, not get stuck in the past. And there's room for everybody in this industry, and you don't have to step on somebody else to get ahead. But it is also important to remember that just following photographers of color doesn't solve any problems. You can't just set it and forget it with this issue. You also need to interact with them and listen to their stories. Become an active ally. In that regard, as I stated earlier this year, the Nerdy Photographer Podcast is open to tell your stories. I am dedicated to telling stories of underrepresented segments within the photography community, and we have to be stronger together. So if you have something you'd like to discuss, reach out and let me know. If you have a story to tell, I want to hear it. Now, a quick break from photography stuff, and I got to get a little nerdy on you guys. I want to talk about The Mandalorian for a minute. Season is over, and we were all consuming so much media at home this year at record levels, and all I can say about 2020 is thank the powers that be for The Mandalorian. With delays in production, I've been waiting for Marvel TV shows for what seems like forever, and other movies that were supposed to be released. I was looking at you, Top Gun. The Top Gun sequel is a hugely anticipated film in my household. Looking forward to it so much. It has been delayed twice now. I'm kind of losing my mind. Going to have to wait till the middle of 2021 to see it. And lots of movies that have come out during the pandemic have, I got to say, been a little disappointing. I'm looking at you, Wonder Woman, 1984. Oof. That storyline had more holes in it than a sponge holding a piece of Swiss cheese. Now, it's kind of hard for me to remember everything that I watched this year because it seems like this year has gone on forever, and I'm not sure what day, 2 weeks ago seems like 3 years ago, and earlier this year seems like yesterday. It's really weird. But I do highly recommend checking out Soul on Disney+. Fantastic movie. Also, Love and Monsters, which I watched recently, was really good and did not succumb to genre stereotypes. Again, looking at you, Wonder Woman 1984. But anyway, The Mandalorian. I have a friend and client who does visual effects work on that show, and they were working nonstop through the pandemic to ensure that the show came out on time. I've really wanted to get him on the show. Is that something you guys would be interested in hearing? Let me know on social media. He's not involved with shooting it, just the visual effects part of the show. And he can't give away any storyline stuff, so just be aware of that. But if enough people express interest, I might be able to convince him to get on the podcast. And that being said, all of the efforts made to get that show edited and released on time were worth it. Though I will say, for a show that made a name for itself by being, quote unquote, adjacent to the original Star Wars this season, especially the ending, and I'm not going to spoil it if you haven't watched it, really seemed to circle back and have a more direct connection, as well as what some might call fan service. But as a fan, I still thought it was great. I loved it. It was fantastic and just really cool. But now I'm curious as to where it's going to go, because there are some pretty dark implications by some things that happened. And, well, I don't want to spoil it for anyone. If you want to talk about it, hit me up on social media. And finally, the story that dominated pretty much everything this year, the pandemic. What can I say? COVID was the story of the year. Lockdowns and social distancing limited how much photographers could work. Industry events and trade shows were canceled outright or became virtual events. And while portrait photographers were able to, manage in some ways by shooting outside or in well-ventilated spaces or by remaining socially distanced, school portrait days were canceled and delayed in the spring and fall, and demand for wedding photography and other special event photography suffered as many those events have been delayed indefinitely or canceled, or downsized. The events have been smaller. I photographed way less weddings than I would in a normal year, and the handful or so of weddings I did photograph were all very intimate events, not big full day events at all. Similarly, the cancellation of most major sporting events has decimated demand for sports photographers. Revenue for the photography industry, and this does not include sales of camera and equipment, that's totally a different industry. This is just money generated by photographers, declined by 12% in 2020. That is billions of dollars with a B, like baby boy, billions of dollars. And with the boom in stock photography sales, because companies weren't able to hire photographers to do shoots for them, it's really hard to tell just how much of an impact the pandemic has had on individual photographers. So, if your photography business has simply made it to the end of 2020, you should consider that a success. And finally, as we close up on this year, let's just remember that the chiming of the clock at midnight on December 31st isn't going to change anything. Just because a new year rolls in doesn't mean things are going to get magically better. You are still going to have to work for your success in 2021. You need to set goals, and you need to check in on those goals, evaluate them as the year goes by, and see what you can do to reach them. Just remember, the Nerdy Photographer podcast and the Nerdy Photographer in general are going to be here to help. So tell us what you would like to hear about. Reach out to us on Facebook, Nerdy Photographer, or on Instagram or Twitter at The Nerdy Photo. Again, that is at The Nerdy Photo. No spaces, no dots, no underlines, just The Nerdy Photo. Tell me what you want to learn to do. How can I help you? What types of stories do you want to hear? Do you want to share your personal story in the photography world? How can we make each other stronger in the coming year? I want to know. Reach out. Well, folks, be sure to subscribe to the Nerdy Photographer podcast. If you haven't already, please do that. And leave us a review. Leave a review wherever you get your podcasts, especially if you get them on Apple Podcasts. It really helps us. Totally does. So have a happy new year. Stay safe and stay nerdy. I'll see you on the other side.
Who's that coming back to town? You better start listening. Who's your heart been beating about? You better listen.
Hey, does your web host really suck? I mean, does it crash all the time? Is your site getting hacked? I had that same experience for many years. My old web host, my site would go down, it seems like once a week. There were always these brute force attacks that would slow it down, and they kept telling me that it was my problem to deal with. That's why I moved over to SiteGround. SiteGround is fast and inexpensive. You can get WordPress hosting for just $3.99 a month. Yep, $3.99 a month. That's pretty cheap. So head over to nerdyphotographer.com/recommends/SiteGround. That's nerdyphotographer.com/recommends/SiteGround.